All right, continuing on our topic of adding integers, we're going to look at efficiently adding integers and other rational numbers, and this is our fourth lesson in this unit. All right, so let's go ahead and review. You're going to answer the following questions in your math journal. So when playing the integer game, you have 3 cards in your hand with a sum of -15. Then you draw a -5 card. Using addition, how would you write an equation to represent your score? Next question, what is the absolute value of 15? Next question, what is the sum of -4 plus -10? In what direction does the arrow point on a number line for a negative number? And what is the additive inverse of a number? What is the additive inverse of 5? What is the additive inverse of -5? Or I'm sorry, -9. All right, so after you've answered those, let's go ahead and start with example 1 on your worksheet. So in the integer game, we would combine 5 and 3 to get 8. Represent the sum of 3 plus 5 as an equation on the number line. So go ahead and do that on the number line on the worksheet and then continue the video. All right, so you should have 3 plus 5 equals 8. You'd have a vector of 3 units long pointing to the right, added with a vector of 5 units long pointing to the right, and your ending spot would be at +8. So how long is the arrow that represents 3? Well, it's 3 units long. And what direction does it point? Well, it would point to the right, or if you were using a vertical number line, it would point up. So how long is the arrow that represents 5? Well, it would be 5 units. And in what direction does that point? Well, it also point right or up. So now what is the sum? The sum is 8. And if you were to represent the sum using an arrow, how long would the arrow be and what direction would it point? Well, the arrow is going to be 8 units long and it's going to point to the right or it's going to point up on a vertical number line. So what is the relationship between the arrow representing the number on the number line and the absolute value of the number? Well, the length of an arrow representing a number is equal to the absolute value of the number. Notice how we're not talking about direction here. We're only talking about the length of the arrow. So do you think that adding 2 positive numbers will always give you a greater positive number, and why? Well, the answer to that is yes, because the absolute values are positive, so the sum will be a greater positive. On a number line, adding them would move you further away from 0 to the right or above on a number line. So let's look at part B. Represent the sum of -3 plus -5 using arrows that represent -3 and -5 on a number line. Go ahead and do that and then continue the video. All right, so you should have something that looks like this. So how long is the arrow that represents -3? Again, it is 3 units. And what direction does it point? Well, it points to the left, or if you like using a vertical number line, it points down. So how long is the arrow that represents -5? That's missing on the video, but that's what it's asking. Well, it'd be 5 units. And what direction does it point? It also points left or down. So what is the sum? Now the sum is -8. And if you were to represent this sum using an arrow, how long would the arrow be and what direction would it point? Well, the arrow would be 8 units long and point to the left or down on a vertical number line. So do you think that adding two negative numbers will always give you a smaller negative number, and why? The answer is yes, because absolute values of negative numbers are positive, so the sum will be a greater positive. However, the opposite of a greater positive is a smaller negative. So on a number line, adding two negative numbers would move you farther away from 0 to the left or below on a number line. So what do both examples have in common? Well, the length of the arrow representing the sum of the two numbers with the same sign is the same as the sum of the absolute values of both numbers. So here is our rule. You need to write this down in your math journal. So adding integers with the same sign by adding the absolute values and using the common sign. So if I'm adding two positive numbers, then my sum is going to be positive. And if I'm adding two negative numbers, then my sum is going to be negative. So let's take a look at exercise 2. Complete this on your lesson worksheet and then continue the video when you are done to check your answers. All right, so you should have finished exercise 2. It asked you to decide whether the sum will be positive or negative without actually calculating the sum. And here are your answers. Negative, positive, negative, negative, and positive, negative. And then for part B, find the sums. You would have 22, negative 20, negative 82, and negative 328. All right, so example 2A on your worksheet. Represent 5 plus negative 3 using arrows on the number line. And you should have something that looks like this. So how long is the arrow that represents negative 3? 3 units. Do you see a pattern happening here? It's the same questions we're asking. So what direction does it point? Well, it points to the left or down. So which arrow is longer? Well, the one with 5 units is longer. So what is the sum? If you were to represent the sum using an arrow, how long would the arrow be and what direction would it point? Well, in negative 3 plus 5 equals 2, the arrow would be 2 units long and it would point to the right or up. All right, so let's take a look at example 2B on your worksheet. Represent 4 plus negative 7 using arrows on the number line. And again, we're going to ask those same questions. In the two examples, what is the relationship between the length of the arrow representing the sum and the lengths of the arrows representing the p-value and the q-value? Well, the length of the arrow representing the sum is equal to the difference of the absolute values of the lengths of both arrows, representing the p-value and the q-value. So what is the relationship between the direction of the arrow representing the sum and the direction of the arrows representing the p-value and the q-value? Well, the direction of the arrow representing the sum has the same direction as the arrow of the addend with the greater absolute value. So write a rule that will give the length and direction of the arrow representing the sum of two values that have opposite signs. See if you can do this on your own. All right, let's see what you came up with. Hopefully it sounds something like this. The length of the arrow of the sum is the difference of the p-value and the q-value, or the two addends. The direction of the arrow of the sum is the same as the direction of the longer arrow. Okay, so the addend that has the longer arrow, depending on what direction it's going, your sum is going to have that same direction. All right, so the rule for adding integers with opposite signs by subtracting the absolute values and using the sign of the integer with the greater absolute value. So exercise 3, complete the problems for exercise 3. Continue the video when you are ready to check your work. And you already have the answers for part 2, finding the following sums. But once you're done, you can, with both of them, you can continue the video. All right, so here is the first part. Circle the integer with the greater absolute value. Decide whether the sum will be positive or negative without actually calculating the sum. So again, this is one way you can kind of, without even figuring it out, you can look at the two numbers and say this is going to be a positive answer, this is going to have a negative answer, and a negative answer. And then you can go back and figure out what the answers are. All right, example 3 on your worksheet. Which add-in has the greatest absolute value, which is the length of the arrow, and what direction does this arrow point? Well, the absolute value of 6 is 6, so the arrow length for 6 is 6 units long, and it's pointing to the right. And for the other one, the absolute value of negative 2 1/4 is 2 1/4, so the arrow length is 2 1/4 long, but it is pointing to the left. So what is the length of this arrow? 6 minus, or the absolute value of 6 minus the absolute value of 2 1/4 is 3 3/4. And what is the final sign? What is the direction of the resulting arrow? Well, since 6 has a greater absolute value, or arrow length, the answer will be positive. So 6 plus a negative 2 1/4 is positive 3 3/4. And so here is the summary of that example. All right, let's take a look at exercise 4. Complete exercise 4 and then continue the video to check your answers. All right, you should be done with exercise 4. And exercise 4 is solve the following problem and show your work. So find the sum of negative 18 plus 7. Again, we want the absolute value of negative 18, which is 18. The absolute value of 7, which is 7. We're going to take the difference between the two of them. So 18 minus 7 is 11. And because negative 18 is the longer arrow and it is pointing to the left, then our answer is going to be pointing to the left also. For part B, circling 73 degrees and falling by 19 degrees, that represents 73 and negative 19. Since 73 is our longer arrow and it's pointing to the right, we know that our arrow, or some arrow, is going to be pointing to the right also. And again, showing the absolute value of 73 and the absolute value of negative 19. It's really important to show this process of finding the absolute value of these numbers, because this is going to come in handy when we start talking about subtraction also. All right, so write the addition sentence finding the sum in the diagram below. So if this is negative 10 and positive 3.5, negative 10 being the longer arrow, and then adding 3.5. So negative 10 plus 7/2, which is taking the mixed number and turning it into an improper fraction. Then you need to find a common denominator, add those together, and then turn it back into a mixed number. So the absolute value of negative 20 halves is 20 over 2. And the absolute value of 7/2 is 7/2. All right, let's wrap this up. So what are the rules of adding numbers with opposite signs? What is the sum of negative 3 plus negative 8? Add integers with the same sign by adding the absolute values and using the common sign. And the steps to adding integers with opposite signs. First, find the absolute value of the integers. Then subtract the absolute values. And then the answer will take the sign of the integer that has the greater absolute value. And last but not least, to add rational numbers, you follow the same rules to use or to add integers. All right, we'll see you in class.